Please be seated. Good morning. Every day when I come to work, I open my Bible and I read a few chapters. I'm very slowly making my way through the whole thing. On Monday, tomorrow, I will start off again on page 1063. I'm about two-thirds of the way through the book of Isaiah. I gotta admit, it's a little dull. I read quickly, and sure, there are some really good stories in there, but there's a lot of parts that just kind of fly right by me because context is really important for understanding the Bible. And if you're just reading it at the surface, you miss a lot. Take today's gospel, for example. There are 4 stories going on there, but we heard only one of them. This is the story we heard today. All right, the first layer of the story. Jesus is walking around the temple with his disciples shortly before he was crucified, somewhere in the early 30s, and the disciples marvel at these huge stones, and Jesus says, yeah, they're impressive, not going to last. And then he goes all Old Testament on them and talks about wars and rumors of wars and famines and insurrections and nation rising against nation and all this mayhem. And then he says, then it'll be okay, but some of you are going to die. And we read that as a prediction of spooky stuff to come. And we've read it that way, mostly, ever since. Now, Jesus said those things in the 30s, but Luke didn't write down the words until the 90s, 3 full generations after Jesus came and went. So, a question for a historian is whether or not anything significant happened between Jesus' life and the written account of Jesus' life. It turns out that one of the most important things in the entire history of the Middle East happened in the interim. In the year 66, Emperor Nero of Halloween fame, Emperor Nero increased taxation on the Jews, and then he attacked the temple and took all the money out of the treasury for himself. As a result, there was a rebellion. And so Rome, being Rome, they attacked brutally. And forces swept down from the north under the power of General Vespasian. Amazingly, the Jewish army defeated a full legion of Roman soldiers. Then they captured and executed 6,000 of them. This is like really poking a bear, though. So then the Emperor Titus came in with more force, pushed Israel all the way back into the walls of Jerusalem, and then surrounded the city and laid siege to it for a few years. In the year 70, they breached the walls of the city. The Romans stormed in, burned most of the city to the ground, and then dismantled the temple stone by stone until almost nothing was left. You still see evidence of this today. If you go to Rome, right near the Colosseum, there's an arch called the Arch of Titus, and on the inside of that arch, you see Roman soldiers destroying the Jewish temple. This was an unimaginable catastrophe for Judaism. You may recall that Jewish theology said God literally lived inside the temple. The temple was gone. Jewish tradition said priests interceded between humans and God to relieve them of their sins. The priests were all dead. Jewish tradition said Jerusalem was the jewel of the promised land, of their promised land that God had given to them. And they were exiled out of Jerusalem. Judaism, as they had known it, was over. As a consequence, Judaism started to reinvent itself. Without priests, teachers out in small towns began to lead the synagogues. These were rabbis. And this is the start of what was called Rabbinical Judaism, which eventually became the Judaism we know mostly today. Meanwhile, this variant of Judaism was starting to gain strength. There was a Jewish rabbi named Jesus who had a number of followers, and they started becoming more vocal. These Christian-ish Jews and the more traditional Jews started fighting over which of them really held or which of them were the heirs to the heritage of Judaism. They were trying to define their identities in reference to Judaism. And so there was a lot of friction between these two groups. And in places they fought over who got to be in the synagogue, and they kicked each other out. Another thing that was taking place occurred within families. Back then, one's religious identity was inherited from the patriarch of one's family. So if your father was Jewish, everybody else was Jewish. But some people were choosing different sides. They were becoming these new kind of Christian Jews. And this caused deep schisms in families and real pain as families split along religious lines. This completely colored the way all four of the Gospels were written and the way all of the Gospels were read by their original audiences. So if you reread this section, it can be very different. That line, some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones. You get the sense that people were yearning for a glorious past with the solidity of the temple. Then all the creepy lines. The days will come when not one stone will be left upon another, and all will be thrown down. Was that a prediction that Jesus made of bad things to come? Or was that an interpretation made after the fact to make sense of what had happened to their beloved temple? All that language of wars and insurrections and family betrayal is probably ex post facto interpretation of historical events. Ex post facto means from a thing done afterwards. Much of the Gospels is an exercise in making meaning out of a very changed world. The story reads quite differently through that lens. But then there's a third layer to this story. Christianity has gone on for a long time. And over the course of our history, we have decoupled the original context of much of the Gospels from the words of the Gospels themselves. We have interpreted the Gospel writing from our own biases. And one habit of Christianity is to take this doom and gloom language and think about it as a prediction of things to come. In our case, we traditionally have conflated it with the book of Revelation and thought about the apocalypse or the end times. And then you add medieval atonement theology to that, which came about 1,000 years later, and you get all this creepiness and we kind of think of this language as God threatening us to literally scare the hell out of us so that we start acting the right way. This is problematic because it betrays really the intent of the whole Bible. The whole story of the Old and New Testaments is about God continually recreating the world with God's people. We see it in the Garden of Eden. We see it when the Jewish people leave Egypt for Israel. We see it when the Jews come out of exile back into Israel. We see it when Jesus goes to the grave and then returns. The story of Christianity is not one of punishment, it's one of perseverance. God continues to coming back to us in a cycle. So read through this lens, the spooky language of the New Testament isn't meant to condemn humanity, it's meant to correct humanity. Jesus didn't come to torture us, he came to transform us. Maybe think of it this way. If life is like a meal at a table, you don't destroy the table at the end of the meal to get the next meal ready. No, you clear the table to make space for more people to join the meal. That seems to be how Jesus imagined God's relationship with humanity. Over and over, we are invited back to the table, no matter how much we bollocks things up. That takes us to the fourth layer of interpretation: the next meal, the next story. We humans have an amazing capacity to take God's blessings and squander them. And God has an amazing capacity to let that go and invite us back and again offer us those blessings. We see this in the passage we heard from Isaiah. Isaiah, this part of it was written, in fact, when the Jews came back out of exile, when they were feeling God's renewing love. For I am about to create new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind, but be glad and rejoice forever in what I am creating. All right, so this is a complicated history to this one part of the gospel. There are 4 parts: an uncritical reading that sees it as Jesus predicting the immediate future, a contextualized reading that sees it as interpretation of past events, and then a later historical reflection upon it, reading it through the lenses of our own human biases, and finally, a 4th layer to this story. That is the layer that has yet to be written, because we are invited back to the table to write that story together with God. We are invited to recreate a world in which God's will is done here on earth, despite our capacity to goof it up. That is why I've been pestering you all autumn with this sign we have out on the street that says, "Who is God calling you to be?" It's the question that Christianity asks us over and over and over. The world changes, our religion changes, we change, but each time we are asked to follow God. God is asking us who we are created to be. All that doomy, gloomy language in the Bible, it's not for punishment, it's for preparation. We are being called anew to follow God. Amen.